You have to pay attention to something in order to move it from sensory memory to short-term memory. Short-term memory. Once information reaches short-term memory, it stays there long enough for you to practice, or review it. Then it leaks out the bottom of the cup. You have a short window of opportunity in which to review. If you fail to do so, you'll forget the information. It vanishes just like it does in sensory memory, though not as quickly. Your first couple of reviews actually happen during the initial learning phase. Remember, Ebbinghaus told us that after 20 minutes memory decays rapidly. So it's only logical we do our first review inside of that 20-minute time frame, usually after 10 minutes, to stop the leak. One additional review within another 20-minute period should hold us over for a full day. These initial reviews strengthen the neural connections that are formed when we first learn. So let's sum up reviewing during the initial learning phase. Initial introduction to the new information, first review after 10 minutes, second review, 20 minutes after the first review. Now we are ready to move into the longer-term review phase, long-term memory. In order for information to move from short-term memory to long-term memory, reviews need to be scheduled appropriately. We derive our review schedule from Hermann Ebbinghaus' spaced repetition system of review. We'll cover that next. Here is a graph that diagrams the process described above. The review phase, using spaced repetition, our goal is to achieve maximum return, i.e., maximum learning, on our investment of time. We'll do that using another of Ebbinghaus' discoveries. It's a method of review known as spaced repetition, or spaced review. Before I teach it to you, I want to explain why it works. There are approximately 100 billion neurons in the brain. Whenever we learn something new, a chemical reaction occurs causing a specific group of neurons to connect in a network. You can think of this little neural network as a pattern. Each memory has its own pattern, its own group of connected neurons. When you act to recall a memory, that group of neurons fires, and you remember. Here's the catch: in order for you to remember, the signal between the neurons needs to be strong. An analogy would be the signal strength on your cell phone. When it's strong, the message, voice, is clear. If the signal is weak, you'll have difficulty communicating. When the signal strength between neurons is weak, we have difficulty remembering, or we may not remember at all. So, the stronger the signal, the clearer the message and the easier for you to remember. It's that simple. What can we do to make the signal strength as strong as possible when we learn? The answer is, space out our reviews. Let me explain. Spacing out your reviews, spaced repetition, is the concept of putting increased intervals of time between each review of a piece of information. Science has shown that if we wait until we're just about ready to forget something, then have to work to recall it, we grow the strongest connections. So, to get the signal strength to grow the strongest, we need to be a little bit rusty on the information when we try to recall it, almost on the cusp of forgetting it when we review. Here's an example of what a spaced repetition study schedule might look like. In the image above where it's marked day 1, let's imagine you learned a piece of information. On that day you did 2 reviews around 20 minutes apart. We'll call those micro-reviews, because they were so close together and on the same day of the initial learning. The reviews that are 1 or more days apart we marked macro-reviews. You would do your first macro-review the day after the initial learning, and then wait until maybe day 6 before reviewing again. Notice the interval of time between reviews has increased. The first macro review is a day after learning the information, but the second is 4 days after that. Now, you'd review again on day 14, and then again on day 38. So there are increased intervals of time between each macro review. Note, here we've reviewed the information 4 times spread out over about a 40-day period. The reason the interval grows is because after each review, we're able to remember the information for a longer period of time. And as we stated above, the idea is to wait until you are on the cusp of forgetting before you review again. An additional advantage to spaced review is it enables us to not only create the strongest signal strength, but do it with the fewest amount of reviews. Typically about 4 on average. After around 4 reviews, the information will move into your long-term memory. Using this method ends up saving you a huge amount of time, especially when you multiply the time savings by the amount of information you're required to learn. One more benefit is by using spaced review, you'll know the information better. As I stated above, you'll remember it long-term. That's the whole idea. You want to be sharp and confident when the time comes you need to call on this information in the real world. What happens when we don't use strategically spaced reviews, If we fail to space out our reviews, long-term memory suffers, i.e., you won't remember. The signal strength won't be as strong. To illustrate this, I'll use an extreme example. Are you old enough to remember landlines? Smartphones weren't always around, you know. Do you remember calling 411 to get a phone number? Rotary phone, well, we used to have to dial 411 to get a phone number. If you couldn't write the number down on a piece of paper, you had to repeat it to yourself until you dialed it, typically about 4 times. In the spaced review example I gave above, we reviewed the information 4 times and achieved long-term memory. In our phone example, we repeated the number 4 times too, but no sooner finished dialing, forgot it. What a difference. Same number of repetitions, completely different results. To recap, if you wish to create the strongest signal strength, there needs to be the right amount of space between your reviews. Spaced repetition is the key. So this is great. But the question is, how do we manage the complex task of scheduling when we have hundreds and hundreds of bits of information to keep track of? That would get really confusing. You can learn how to easily accomplish this in How to Use Spaced Repetition with Flashcards. How to Study Effectively Using Active Recall. Another concept I want to drive home is the idea of active vs passive recall. Earlier I stated the secret to long-term memorization is knowing when and how to review. We learned the when part, using spaced review. This next idea pertains to the how. Let me start by saying, deep, fast learning happens when you work to get information out of the brain as opposed to putting it in. Let me explain what I mean. Passive recall is what we are engaged in when we read through our notes. Information is flowing into the brain as we go down the page. We are lulled into a sense of security believing we're remembering what we are reading, simply because we understand it. But that's not the case. Remember the leaky cup. This rote-type learning would take excess repeated application for the information to stick. That's because the neurons aren't firing hard enough for the pathways to form strong connections. You're babying them along with passive recall. Active recall, on the other hand, is when we are forced to retrieve information from the brain without any outside help, like our notes. A flashcard is a perfect example of active recall in action. If you check out How to Use Spaced Repetition with Flashcards, you'll see we need to break information down into its smallest components. This accomplishes 2 things. First, it enables us to place a single question on a flashcard. 1 question. 1 answer. When we read the question, then recall and say the answer before turning the card over to check it, we are working to get information out of our brain. We're processing. This is when the real learning happens. The second reason for breaking down longer pieces of information into small pieces is to track it. This way, we can spend more time on things that need work, and less time on things that don't. We won't have it all grouped together like in our notes. The bottom line is we won't waste time studying what we know. This is all explained clearly in How to Use Spaced Repetition with Flashcards. Don't miss it. I put it together especially for you. So take advantage of it. Flashcards are extremely powerful. This is especially true if you combine them with mnemonics and a spaced repetition review schedule. To wrap up our talk about active recall, just remember it's a vital component to speedy, long-term memorization. Don't pass up the opportunity to use it. One of the most effective study techniques isn't a study technique at all. It's called rest. That's right. And it comes in 2 forms: study breaks and sleep. You'll learn the information faster if you get away from it for a while. If you study for too long a stretch, you reach a point of diminishing returns. You'd be much further ahead of the game if you'd take a 15 minutes break every so often. Allow your brain a refresh. Then come back and hit it again. Only now your mind will absorb more. Go for a walk. Go have a glass of water. Just do something different. Get enough sleep. Only you know what the right amount of time is for you. This is especially important come exam time. You gotta be fresh. When you're tired, your brain won't work the way you need it to. Sleeping put these ideas into action. Now you know how the memory experts study/review information. Now it's your turn to implement the ideas. It's one thing to understand the concepts, but quite another to use them. Ignore the little voice in your head trying to convince you to continue studying the way you always have. It's easier, really, it's not. If you take the time to implement what you've learned here, you'll save tons of time in the long run. You will study less and remember more, or study the same amount and learn lots more. Either way, you win. See you next time. Happy learning!